The first Kamikaze. In the fall of 1944, Imperial Japan faced a critical situation in the Pacific War against the United States. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly appointed to lead the First Air Fleet, found himself confronted with the daunting task of countering the advancing American forces, particularly during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where US Navy aircraft carriers posed a significant threat. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, Onishi, initially reluctant to embrace unconventional tactics, shifted his stance. The decisive turning point came after substantial Japanese losses in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and subsequent American raids on Formosa, Truk, and Palau, resulting in the loss of over 800 aircraft. With irreplaceable losses and facing superior American forces, Onishi concluded that conventional tactics would lead to the inevitable destruction of his remaining planes and ill-trained pilots. Embracing the concept of suicide attacks, Onishi acknowledged the sacrifices already made by individual pilots and decided to formalize this approach as a sanctioned military strategy. His change of perspective was driven by the harsh reality that his limited and outdated aircraft, numbering around 150, stood little chance against the growing might of the U.S. Navy. Upon taking command of the 5th Base Air Force in Manila, Onishi recognized the inadequacy of his forces to defend the Philippines and the inevitability of their annihilation. The notion of sacrifice for the emperor and adherence to the Bushido Code, exemplified by Admiral Masafumi Arima's intentional suicide mission on October 15, further influenced Onishi's decision to adopt suicide air missions as a desperate but necessary measure to confront the formidable American advance in the Pacific War. In October 1944, the desperation of Imperial Japan in the Pacific War led to the adoption of suicide missions, notably embodied by Admiral Masafumi Arima's sacrificial attempt. Arima, stripping his flight suit of rank insignia, piloted a Betty bomber towards an enemy target amidst intense anti-aircraft fire. Unfortunately, his plane was down before completing the mission, but news of his heroic intent. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, recognizing the potential impact of such courage, considered the idea of suicide missions as a way to inspire men to face glorious deaths in battle. While Onishi is often credited as the primary advocate of these missions, other officers were already contemplating the desperate measure. When Onishi discussed the concept with senior commanders in Tokyo, there was no strong objection to these special missions conducted by volunteer airmen. Onishi rationalized the use of such tactics as a way to let young men die beautifully, coining the term toko for this form of self-sacrifice. The well-known terms kamikaze, or divine wind, is part of the Japanese concept of self-sacrifice, with Onishi choosing the 201st Air Group to pioneer the suicide tactic. On October 19, he informed the volunteer pilots, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, about their mission to crash into American warships. The gravity of the situation and the importance of the show operation were emphasized, stating that the fate of the empire depended on their efforts. The initial group of 23 volunteer pilots, named Shinpu, was organized into 4 sections, each with patriotic names. Following final approval from Vice Admiral Gunichi Maikawa, Onishi's special attack squadrons were set in. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a 23-year-old veteran and Naval Academy graduate, was chosen to command the 1st Special Attack Squadron. Despite the gravity of the task, Seki willingly accepted the appointment, embodying the spirit of the modern samurai in the face of the Pacific War's challenges. While some sources indicate that Lieutenant Yukio Seki was dutiful but reserved about his impending death, expressing no fervent patriotism or Bushido-driven zeal, others embraced the prospect of dying for the emperor with enthusiasm. The cultural and educational background of these young Japanese aviators instilled a deep sense of duty to the emperor, viewing death in his service as the greatest honor. Despite Seki's pragmatic response to the news agency correspondent, 23 young fighter pilots volunteered for suicide attacks, becoming the vanguard of approximately 3,000 800 Kamikaze airmen during the Pacific War. Regardless of individual convictions, the rapid formation of these suicide groups became a central strategy of the Japanese High Command after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The first Japanese air attack, led by Seki on October 21, 1944, aimed at crashing into American warships. The Shikishima Group's Zero fighters took off, but bad weather limited their search area, resulting in no. Meanwhile, the Yamato Group faced setbacks as their fighters were destroyed, and the Asahi Group was tasked with establishing a kamikaze operation in Mindanao. Frustration grew among the pilots until the first suspected suicide contact occurred on October 24. The USS Sonoma, a fleet tug, was attacked by a flight of Betty bombers, with one crashing into the ship, causing severe damage and ultimately sinking in shallow water. The Augustus Thomas, an adjacent freighter, was also damaged, raising questions about the intent of the Japanese pilots and marking a potential early instance of kamikaze-inflicted damage on a U.S. Navy ship. On October 21, a solo suicide attack targeted the LCL 1065 at the Light Beachhead, an American landing craft infantry designed for seagoing transport. Conflicting reports identify the Japanese aircraft involved as either a Betty or a Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally. Regardless, the plane was on fire upon crashing, leading to the swift sinking of the vessel, resulting in 7 dead, 9 wounded, and 5 missing. These early sorties were not part of Onishi's special attack units, and it remains uncertain if they were intentional suicide missions. However, they foreshadowed the coming storm. On the morning of October 25, the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet's escort carrier groups, known as Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, faced a formidable Japanese task force, including the super battleship Yamato. Taffy 3, commanded by Admiral Clifton of Sprague, valiantly resisted, convincing the Japanese force that they encountered a more powerful opposition. Despite the harrowing encounter, Kurita ordered his task force to retire, leaving Taffy 3 to tend to its losses. The day took another grim turn as all 3 Taffy units experienced a series of kamikaze attacks. Taffy 1, targeted around 7:30 a.m., saw a kamikaze striking the U.S. Santee's flight deck, causing significant damage, but with the fortunate avoidance of nearby unexploded bombs. Subsequently, a torpedo from a Japanese submarine hit Santee on the starboard side, leading to substantial flooding. While the kamikaze attack resulted in 16 casualties and 27 injuries, the carrier survived the battle. During the intense encounter, the anti-aircraft defenses of Taffy 1 were fully engaged, and explosions from shell bursts illuminated the sky. A second Japanese plane targeted the carrier U.S. Suwannee, but was thwarted by a well-aimed 5-inch 127 mm shell from Suwannee itself, causing it to crash into the sea before reaching its intended escort carrier, Sangama. Another kamikaze aim for the escort carrier USS Petrov Bay was brought down by anti-aircraft fire, just short of its target. Suwannee successfully downed yet another kamikaze and damaged a third, which, despite trailing smoke, continued its course toward Petrov Bay. The persistent pilot, changing targets, crashed into Suwannee's flight deck, detonating its bomb between the flight and hangar decks. Effective damage control contained the aftermath, and Suwannee, after a hurried repair of the 10th by 25th Rimi 6M hole in the flight deck, resumed air operations by 10 a.m. on October 26 at 12:40 p.m. Another kamikaze struck Suwannee, colliding with a just-recovered torpedo bomber on the flight deck. Although a fiery spectacle ensued, secondary fires were brought under control. Suwannee suffered 107 casualties and 160 wounded in this 2-day ordeal. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 suicide Zeros from Mabalacat, accompanied by 4 Zeros under the command of Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. The flight encountered American Hellcat fighters shortly after takeoff, resulting in Nishizawa claiming 2 victories. However, the E-escort and suicide planes became separated during the skirmish. Nevertheless, Seki identified Taffy 3 in distress as its operational carriers were recovering engaged aircraft. Exploiting the immediate distraction, the kamikaze planes flew low to avoid radar detection. With combat air patrols low on fuel, the attackers went undetected until they increased altitude above 5,000 feet. The alarm came too late for effective intervention by US fighters. The first kamikaze targeted the escort carrier U.S. Kamikaze at 10:50 a.m., using the ship's bridge as an aiming point. The plane crashed into the port catwalk before plunging into the sea, causing considerable damage. Two more Zeros aimed for the escort carrier, Fanshawe Bay, but succumbed to anti-aircraft fire. Another pair tried to dive on the escort carrier White Plains, but faced intense opposition from the carrier and surrounding warships. One of the attackers, seemingly damaged and emitting smoke, altered course towards the escort carrier CLO. The pilot adjusted the dive angle before releasing a 550 lb 250 K bomb and skidding across the flight deck, spewing aviation fuel that ignited numerous fires. The bomb triggered a massive explosion among refueled and rearmed aircraft on CLO's hangar deck. The ensuing blaze and secondary explosions doomed the ship, sinking within half an hour and claiming the lives of around half of its 889-man crew. SLO was the second escort carrier of Taffy 3 lost that day, following the earlier sinking of Gambier Bay in the confrontation with Kurita's battleships and cruisers. Accounts differ regarding Seki's mission, with some stating that he initiated the dive and crashed into COO, while others claim he targeted the escort carrier U.S. Kalinin Bay, followed by two others. Regardless, Seki perished in the attack. Kalinin Bay sustained damage to its flight deck and aft port stack from two kamikazes, resulting in 5 deaths and 55 injuries. Buoyed by the success of the kamikaze raids on October 25, the Japanese continued these suicide attacks on the next day, deploying their remaining aircraft from CBU. Suwannee, during its second kamikaze strike, had an Avenger torpedo bomber positioned atop the forward elevator, creating a massive fireball upon impact. Fortunately, 9 other aircraft located on the forward section of the flight deck did not explode, and the ensuing fire was extinguished within 2 hours. In the same time frame, Petrov Bay narrowly avoided 2 Zeros, one landing just 20 yards off the starboard bow and the other a mere 15 FE 4.5 from the escort carrier's fantail. U.S. Sangamon also reported a near miss from a suicide attacker. The American response to these early kamikaze attacks was marked by astonishment at the dedication and ferocity of the Japanese suicide pilots. Efforts were made to counter these new tactics, with Vice Admiral Lloyd Mustin, an experienced officer in gunnery, radar, and fire control, acknowledging the intense confusion caused by kamikaze pilots. He noted the difficulty in identifying the target amidst numerous possibilities, emphasizing the challenge faced by well-trained personnel in a ship's combat information center SEC. As the U.S. Navy recognized the Japanese intention to deploy a large number of kamikazes, they increased combat air patrols, utilized early warning picket ships to enhance radar operations, and developed innovative tactics leveraging emerging technology. Despite these efforts, kamikaze pilots persisted in their determined attacks on the U.S. fleet until the conclusion of the Pacific War, most notably off the island of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Despite the considerable death and destruction caused by kamikaze strikes, the underlying motive for these suicide missions reveals a stark reality. Their originators, particularly Onishi, acknowledged that the war was lost. The desperate hope that the overwhelming might of the Allied forces seeking to crush Imperial Japan could be somehow overcome in the war's final months proved to be nothing more than an illusion.